Well, good evening and thank you for being here tonight. My name is Duff Crerar. I'm one of the people who, along with Mike Hodges, has prompted this series and has invited various guests to come. Mike can't be with us tonight. He's laid aside by illness. And so I'm here holding the fort with Alan Jones, he's pastor of the Church of Christ. Alan's been pastor here for 30?
1983.
Okay.
So
Since 1983. Right, so you are a veteran with long service in this outpost of the Kingdom of God. And so we've looked at this question often, and in some ways it's been part of the background. The big question in the background for much of this evening will be the one that's been behind us in all the series, and that is, what is the point of church? It's one thing to say, what is church? Another thing to say, what is Christianity? In fact, historians of the church today prefer to say we are historians of Christianity, not the church, because there are so many denominations and divisions and subdivisions within the institutions of the church. But the real question remains, why? And what is the point? And what is the church? Especially as we go through a period now where the traditional privileges, the traditional power, the traditional organization is all under attack, under threat. And in fact, even the weekly gathering together in one building has been severely truncated by COVID, and whether technology has replaced it or not, the function of church. I think for many people, we look around and we don't see the same energy to get back together that we were expecting to. I was listening to a commentator today talking about how Canadians saved up so much money during the lockdown in the deep days of COVID, that as soon as the markets opened up, there was this orgy of buying, which has helped create the shortage of things that we have now. Canadians have been spending like drunken sailors. We haven't seen exactly Christians coming back to church with that same enthusiasm, it seems. And so the question becomes, what is church? Maybe we have to ask that question again. And who better to ask than you, Alan? Not that you have the only answer, but you certainly have had commitments and made decisions and have done some thinking on this. So, what is the point of church?
It's a difficult question in some ways, because I think if I think about the church and what is the church, there's sort of the church collected and the church dispersed. Mm-hmm. Oftentimes I think when people say, come back to church, in that language we're thinking about the church gathered, the church collected in some forms, and I think that is in large part what's been called into question, because I think that Christians have forgotten or not experienced the value of the church gathered, and they think for some folks that the church scattered, which is still the church. Mm-hmm. The reality is, biblically speaking, if you are a follower of Jesus, you are the church. And if you are not the church, then you are not a follower of Jesus. It is theologically and biblically impossible to separate the two.
The church and the believer.
Yeah, you can't do it. And so, for me, when I think about what is the church, first of all, church, we understand it's a modern word, but it is not a modern construct. It's just the English word we use for ecclesia, the gathering. Mm-hmm. We understand that, and so let's just put that aside for a moment. We understand church, we gather, we understand that. But to me, when we think about what is the church, the images that the New Testament in particular, growing out of our Hebraic roots of the tribe, nation, clan tribe, nation, temple, before that of course tabernacle, and then synagogue most in the end. All that's sort of our heritage, but if we think about just the New Testament portion of it, which builds a lot on those things, I think there are several images for me which really stand out to describe what the church is. And I think if we take those images seriously, we begin to get a sense of the importance of the church.
Okay, so let me throw a verse at you. Jesus says, wherever two or three are gathered in my name, I'm there. Is that a church?
That would be the church if they follow through with certain descriptors. That would be the church. Otherwise, it can be Christians gathered.
Yeah, okay, so,
Christians just having coffee.
Yeah,
so,
right, yeah.
So I mean,
Okay.
and Christians having coffee, and me sitting with you or a bunch of my peers. You know, here we are, same demographic, same
Sure.
whatever. I mean, we're slightly different theologically, but we're in sort of the same path. Maybe a bit further apart politically, but other than that, I mean, it's just two buddies getting together, which is not the church.
but I would think that's an important point. One of the defining points about church that I've heard recently is it is a place where people of very different politics, very different demographics, very different ages, very different languages even, or ethnic background can still come and have a point of fellowship and a point of life together that is in fact created by a kind of miracle of Jesus being in their midst, right?
Yeah, 100%. You know, back in the ancient days of the 80s and 90s,
Yes, that's right.
when I first
Before the flood.
started out in these things,
Yeah.
the church growth movement was
Yeah.
vibrant, and the thing we all were educated in and so on. But part of the church growth movement, just so you know, was the break down as many barriers we can for people coming to know Christ.
Right.
And
Yeah.
one of the barriers that they had was differences.
Yeah.
So they said, let's have a homogeneous unit. And the thing was, look, let's just have churches that suit everybody.
Yes.
And so let's have a Caucasian church, a Filipino church, let's have a young people's church, a married people's church, a church of seniors and so on. And the great criticism of the church growth movement was, that isn't church. If you have a homogeneous unit, it is not the church.
Yeah.
It is a bunch of similar people getting together of the same thoughts and in the same echo chamber.
Yeah, it's so consumerist.
Yeah,
you
the
know,
church,
pick your brand.
yeah, the church, to be the church, has to be varied.
Yeah.
It has to be inclusive. It has to be demographically broad in every sense of the
That's
word.
what Paul is saying again and again in Galatians, first of all, but in everything he writes after that. You cannot have a church that's divided, but at the same time claims to be a body of Christ. It's one body.
Yeah.
It's an organic model, not like a bag of marbles that all
Yeah.
shake together. It's a body knit together with different organs and different functions.
Yeah.
The problem I see, though, is that what people are looking at now is, well, I'll go where I feel at home, or I'll stay where my needs are being met. And that might just be staying at home, coffee in hand, in your pajamas, watching it on video. Now, is that church?
No.
Why not?
Because there is not it is the entrance into the church, I would say.
Okay.
But without human connection, it is not yet the church. Now, you know, we're all struggling with this online side of things, but I was reading a fellow today who is a huge proponent and a leader on the online church.
Okay.
But he says, look, here's the deal. The church online, if that's all you do, it's a C+. When
Okay.
really the church, as a fully functioning, healthy church, is an A.
Yeah.
So you're moving toward it, but you've got to have that connection. You have to be able to weep together, laugh together, shake hands together. You know, Dr. Henshaw, just to bring in the
Yes.
controversy,
Yes, of course.
but you know, they had these town halls early on
Yes.
with religious leaders.
Yes.
And I really appreciate one of the things that Dr. Henshaw said was, look, the reason that we're worried about churches, he said, is because when you, and she goes to church, as I could tell, you do everything that is, you hug, you sing out loud, you shake hands, you eat meals together. You know, this defines the church gathered, and which is why we're such a trouble. And so, if you don't have that, it's not quite the church. You know, it's just that God. You know, Pilgrim's Progress is a great book, but there's an inherent
Individualism. to
problem with it.
Yes.
Is that, you know, it feeds our Western egotistical radical individualism,
Yeah.
which is the antithesis
Have
of
to do it all
God's
myself.
picture for the church.
Yeah. So here's another question then. We used to say, not everyone, but you know, one of the common understandings was that religion is something you did in your solitude. Now you're saying we have to do it in a community that has what I would call signs of life. And the signs of life are these activities that are done together in a group that involve, unfortunately, health risks. I remember the debates about a common communion cup so many years ago when the AIDS crisis broke out, right? And then we discovered this process called intinction, where you dipped your bread in the cup rather than put your lips on the cup, right? And how that reassured so many people. But the interesting thing is that what you're saying is that these activities are essential, but they're now broken.
Yeah, I would say that within our Christian experience, even within the church, there's a difference between solitude and isolation. I mean, I think within the Christian practice, within our growth, within the disciplines that we practice, solitude can be and should be a powerful part. So there is a time to be alone with the Holy Spirit, to dive into His Word, to be
personal,
to be in prayer, all that stuff. What I'm afraid of is that we think that isolation, that I don't need you.
Yes.
And that's not solitude, that's isolation.
Yes.
And so, you read the church fathers, I mean, you can go on about this way more than me. I mean, solitude is a huge positive thing, isolation. And we have, I think, come close to the danger of isolation.
Okay.
Where it's me and Jesus, as I understand Him, as I get it, and there's no corrective of you saying, Alan, are you sure that's what the Word says? Are you sure that? And it's dangerous.
Yeah, so dialogue is important. Even critical thinking in a body face to face, because we're talking again and again about how much of what we've done in the past has been unthought Christianity. And now we're saying, wait a minute, think through why as well as what the church is.
Yeah.
So let me take another question. There's another Bible verse in Hebrews, right? Do not forsake the gathering together, for encourage it.
Yeah.
Because of those who have wandered off from the faith.
Yeah.
Now, how do you read that into our situation now?
I think it is a great warning for what is happening to a lot of folks. I think as I speak with people, they found themselves drifting, and not intentionally, but drifting. First from the community of faith, and then slowly the disciplines fall away. We get distracted, and a good number of folks have found themselves in a place. I never intended to be here. There is power in coming together and being together, and seeing Duff. And Duff phoning me up when I don't feel like being in church, or I don't feel like being with other Christians, saying, hey Alan, where are you? Well, I don't feel like it, I'm down, and whatever. No, now is when you need it the most.
Yeah.
There's power in that draws me back, and it's just dangerous to let ourselves not be there to encourage and challenge.
So what I hear you saying, though, is that when we're watching it as observers, and even if we're intellectually and emotionally trying to sing along and empathize and everything else, that the Holy Spirit can only do so much, and that the actual chemistry of the Holy Spirit interacting in the body of believers has to happen face to face in physical presence with each other.
Yeah, there's an extra power there. I mean, I would not want to say, we're old guys, and so we're not digital natives,
True.
And so there's probably a lot more depth to those things than
The digital
than you and I,
get
would
more out
have.
of it.
I think, but even as I speak to young people who are digital natives, who've been playing online gaming with folks,
Yeah, true.
for 5 years, but when they get a chance to meet person to person, whether they're in that other city or whatever, they get together, they do it, they see face to face. We're created to experience that, it's just part of who we are as creators.
So we look at the Bible and we see God takes a family, Abraham's family, then He creates a clan, then He creates a tribe, and then He creates a nation. But in no case, even though individuals may be alone in times of trial or pressure like Joseph or others, at no time are they separated from each other, even when they're supposed to be gathering to other people or performing different functions. And in the early church, of course, going out. Unlike the Hebrew model, the early church model is to go out and make disciples, not expect them to come and join you. That all is risky face-to-face confrontation and communication. Now, in my time, having been a father of young children, who are no longer young, but now have their own young children, getting them out to church is a trial. Now, in our time, I don't know how we did it. We were often just barely on time, but somehow in the 70s and 80s, we got to church on time with our children. We got up in the morning, Sunday morning, it was a drill, right? Bang, 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 clothes on, teeth brushed, hair combed, check the adjustment of the costume. Boys, are your flies up? Girls, are your ball, your zipper done and everything. Get in the church, put the seatbelts on in the little seats, drive to the church, get them to Sunday school, and then with a sigh of exhaustion and relief, slide into your adult pew for the morning service. Now, I can't imagine that happening in the 2020s, because I think of my own daughter and son-in-law working like Trojans to get those kids up. It's the same drill, but it seems to be harder on them than it is. And for them, is it downstairs to the TV or the computer with our coffee, and the kids have their activity for themselves or their little books, and I don't have the hassle of getting out to church like I used to. And that's attractive. It reminds me of my friends who gave up the church for golf because it was more serene. There wasn't the friction, as we call it in military thinking, and there wasn't the fog of war either. Getting to church, sometimes arriving at church in anything but a sanctified mood, and with gritted teeth carrying on, getting into the service. Now, why go through all that?
Well, I think, for some weeks, that's a valid...
It's a real experience.
It's a valid response. And I hope, and I mean, we've put a lot of time and energy into online participation,
Yes,
as much as we can.
Yeah.
But for the long term, it doesn't give the whole picture. I mean, even thinking about your children, I think it's so critical that our children encounter Sunday school teachers, preachers, elders, whatever, who have a different theology than we as parents do, and don't always guide every single thing. Because it could be that my kids grow up and have a different view than I do, and if they think that mine is the only answer, my answer is the only answer, my perspective is the only perspective, and they think that just doesn't make sense because I'm not very bright. If they don't have Duff and his perspective in there as an alternative, and I'm going to hear what Duff has to say to that. Now, hopefully, it takes a village to raise a child, or whatever.
Exactly.
The church comes together, and hopefully we support one another as families and parents. But it's very important that my kids hear Duff's view as well as Alan's view. And I think that happens when they come gathered and they hear communion meditation, different preachers, the Sunday school teacher, youth leaders, youth pastors, youth leaders, different peers. And I think it gives a holistic perspective on the faith and the realization that I don't have to agree with Dad 100%.
No,
100%.
especially as teenagers.
Or whatever,
Right.
There's a bigger picture.
My youth pastor was a much better Christian than my dad when I was 17. Somehow he changed after I got older. But at that time, I'd rather hear the gospel from my youth pastor than from my dad.
Yeah.
On the other hand, I could digest and debate the gospel after church with my dad, given the experience I'd had with the youth pastor or a Sunday school teacher. And I did have some remarkable Sunday school teachers. That's, I think, one of the interesting questions for a lot of people now is to think back through their church experience and ask themselves, what are the experiences that I might be denying my offspring or my grand offspring by trying to protect them from whatever irritants we have with our church experience. But let me throw another one at you, because if I do exit interviews, and I occasionally do what are called an exit interview with somebody, why aren't you coming to church anymore? The first thing they throw at me is politics. It doesn't...
Like what kind of politics?
Well, church politics, power games, settling scores from the pulpit.
It's marvelous. It's a
family politics, family dynasties. So the way in which the word, of course, the death word is hypocrite.
Yeah, which is like that. You see, to me, this is the brilliance of the church. We have to see the muck of the church in all of its ugliness, because that's the wisdom of God.
Okay.
Because
You want to go with that?
like what does Ephesians tell us about the church? Ephesians tells us about the church that the glory of the church is that God, the wisdom of God is displayed to the angels and the heavenlies in the church.
Yeah.
What? Yeah, God's wisdom is that in His grace, He takes these stubborn, rebellious, power-hungry, sinful, selfish, self-righteous,
Stupid.
hypocritical
Yes.
creatures who happen to have, in a moment of sanity, nodded their head to Jesus
Yeah.
and says, I'm going to take this bunch and I'm going to keep it together for thousands of years, and I'm going to make them the hope of the world, and it is going to carry forth my mission in spite of who they are. So if somebody says that to me, I say, I'm so glad that you have been exposed to the wisdom of God in the sinfulness of Alan Jones, who in his mercy and in his grace and somehow in his wisdom knew that you're better off with Jones trying to do it than perfection. Who know? I mean, that is the wisdom. But James says, hey man, that's not human wisdom, that's wisdom from above. But that's what it is. God,
So we're back to a paradox of faith then, that what God has intended and which Jesus has commissioned us to do is form imperfect communities of flawed people, of limited perspective, different intellects, different degrees of wealth, different degrees of race and ethnicity and gender, and say, build me a family, a super family.
Be my family and include it all, and somehow through it all love each other.
Yeah.
Be in that mix and don't be so self-righteous you walk away.
Right on. And when you do, you are embodying me.
Yeah.
Right. Now, when you say that on a Sunday morning to a camera, are you kind of, I think every pastor has to have a lot of faith every Sunday morning, or they might as well just take a club and go to the golf course, except maybe in northern Canada. But you have the faith to say that miracle and announce it to a camera, knowing that somebody out there is going to be echoing that back at you. Now, is that something that we have to say, okay, but that's only half a loaf. The rest of the loaf has to be done in person. So where are you? Do we challenge people with that now? I can hear you breathing, we used to say when nobody would laugh at your jokes in the pulpit.
Yeah.
But now we can't even do that. Where are you? Are you out there? Are you coming? We say come back home to the church. But the question is, will you make the effort? Will you be here? Or will we have good intentions? Like all my friends who went to play golf saying, oh, I'll come to church in a while, but I'm going to go to the golf course for a while. I never saw them again. What's the call? What's the prophetic call that reminds people that this has to be done in person?
I don't know.
Okay, let me ask you some questions. Would you get a vaccination for Jesus?
Would I get a vaccination for Jesus?
Yes. Because if that's what's keeping you from going to church,
Oh.
serving Jesus means getting a vax. Would you wear a mask for Jesus? Now, I know you do. Don't get me wrong. I'm not playing rhetorical.
Yeah.
But there's someone who says, I hate this thing, but for Jesus' sake to go to church, I will wear one.
Well, that's the bigger issue is, listen, I'm not going to get vaccinated. I'm not going to wear a mask for Jesus.
And then what? You won't be at church.
Well, this is the problem. Unless from that perspective, everybody that follows Jesus sees that it's not much. I'm just saying that.
Yeah, okay.
The other side is
fair enough.
It's perfectly obvious.
Yeah.
That if you love Jesus, you're not going to yield to this stuff, and so if we would all just get a spine and stand up for what is obviously true, then the church would finally make a difference. And then we have the other side, would you for Jesus wear a mask, would you? And so that I think is more the dilemma is that we have both perspectives within the church. But this is where, the great disappointment, of course, we're going to get into a whole other topic here, but the great disappointment is that we haven't been able to navigate those waters in a way that's different than the world.
Yes.
And so therefore, the wisdom of God is not being displayed. It's when you and I have radically different opinions, and yet somehow somehow remain intimate brothers
Yes.
in spite of it. That's when the wisdom of God is shown, and that's when the glory of God is shown, and that's when the church makes a difference.
So the church right now, divided on these issues, is grieving Jesus.
Division grieves Jesus always, absolutely.
All right, so we are responsible to some degree for his tears right now over the state of the church. Mind you, maybe he always has been crying for the state of the church because of other issues too, like slavery
well,
and other
that's-
races.
There's always issues, but we're kind of wandering off.
No, we're not. We're looking at the question of why church now?
Yeah.
What's the point? And we're looking in our mirror, and we're saying, am I only looking at myself? Is that right? If I'm looking at myself and it's drawing me away or keeping me from entering into that intimate fellowship, one way or another, then why am I holding back? Why am I drawing a line? I mean, why am I dividing the body of Christ? I mean, why am I withdrawing from fellowship? And often, sometimes with a great deal of anger.
Or denying fellowship by saying you can't come
sure.
unless.
Well, that's the other thing. We say you can't.
So-
come in. So all right. So being a Christian this time is risky, one way or the other. If you're either going to lose that sense of intimacy or you're going to lose your life. I mean, I'm thinking black and white because that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about a time when souls are being counted,
Yeah.
and we have to say, okay, so what am I going to risk for Jesus? Now, maybe it's fellowship. Maybe it's our health. But I guess I'm looking at this thinking, okay, so if Jesus says, well, what are you thinking? What are you deciding? Because that's what a critical thinker has to do. They have to make a decision. They get the best evidence, they listen to the best thinking, and obviously you can't trump Jesus on his thinking about the church. It is the best. And you presented it well tonight. The question is, what do I decide on that basis? Because, as you know, the prophets had a habit, especially my friend Elijah, of saying, stop jumping from one leg to the other. Decide, either God is God or he's not, or Baal is. So the question maybe is, from my perspective, when we look at ourselves on a Sunday in the mirror, or we look at the church that we're not going to, or we look at the church we are going to, but I'm putting up with a lot of frustrations. I mean, singing through a mask is a drag. Having soda crackers in a plastic wrapper is a drag. This is not the church that I signed up for, but is the church I will live with in love to carry on the mission. But for other people, the question is, have they even asked that question? You know?
Yeah, well, who knows the hearts of other people? I mean, we don't even hardly know our own hearts.
Well, that's, I mean, you know what Jeremiah says about the human heart.
Yeah, that's what I mean. So I think that a lot of people are wrestling through those things. I think that we haven't done a good job facilitating conversation.
But do we have to leave that up to the clergy? Do we have to leave that up to
No,
our
because there
leaders? or
shouldn't be
should
any
we-
clergy.
Well, sure, Church Christ model is no clergy. I'm just saying then, should we have people that are not in front of the microphone leading that discussion for the people that are going to be in front of the microphone? It shouldn't be your job, should it?
I think it shouldn't be my job because
Left up to you.
I think, I think that we do it in our relationally through a network of relationships because,
Right, okay.
in our conversations that we have with our brothers and sisters and somehow in the wisdom of God and the glory of God will be seen and somehow God will have us muddle through it.
So maybe the
That's when we don't
question,
talk.
maybe the question is we haven't prayed and quested with God deep enough to find that solution because we've allowed ourselves to be stymied by health regulations, mask regulations, vaccination regulations, our own human nature from plumbing or finding that missing solution that will get us through this. Because is this going to be a permanent state? We're all assuming it won't be. We're all assuming that at some point enough people will be surviving this that will be able to return to a community, and maybe COVID will be something like having a bad cold. And that may well be, because science is on our side, so is time, and human genetics. But the real question for me is, okay, so when do we find that decision point in ourselves to say, I will not live a solitary, absentee Christian life, living by the media, I have to live it in person. Is that the question we have to answer for ourselves? And when we can answer that, then we'll know.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's part A, 1A of the question, but then to me, the more fundamental question is, am I going to live this out in a community that is diverse?
Okay.
That's not just you and I have agreed, okay, Duff, you know, it so happens, you and I both vaccinated, you and I both wear masks, by and large, and so then I have to decide to not just, in my opinion, to not only have fellowship and to call the church and to be together with like-minded people. I will never grow and be stretched and be encouraged and challenged just by my peers and like thinkers.
Yeah,
And,
all like-alikes.
yeah, you can't. That's not the church. That is just dangerous. Dangerous. You know, there has to be from you know, with the inverted pyramid of leadership. You know, elders and boards are at the bottom, and you know, serving. That conversation and that discussion and that prayer has, and it always has. I mean, it's not like, again, I should be quiet. You should speak. It's not like this is the first time the church has faced
No kidding.
issues. How about Jew and Gentile? You know, I mean,
Oh, yeah, exactly.
it's
Yes.
you know, the New Testament is just half of it's written. A good portion is written of Paul trying to the driving force, hey, I'm doing this collection from the Gentiles to take the Jews,
That's right.
because you guys, you're still not getting it that you're one family and you've got to do it together. And then you could speak ad nauseum, I'm sure, century by century.
Well, nothing I say is nauseating. Now, come on. No, but
you know,
certainly
of-
at
of
right,
the thing,
shall
yeah.
we say.
You know,
yeah.
it's so-
and granted, that's the challenge of the church, is to overcome whatever things are thrown at us by the world: war, peace, famine, pestilence, you know, bad telephone connections, whatever. But the bottom line, I think, is, and this is where I want to move towards as a kind of a concluding note, is there a place where it becomes irresistible to the Christian as an individual to join in personal fellowship? And if that doesn't happen, if it comes to the point where you actually can help not going to church, instead of can't help but go to church, is the church dead?
Well, the church will never be dead. Congregations can be dead.
Fair enough.
But the church will always be the church triumphant, because it is God's entire plan.
Right. Yes.
You know, so there'll always be I mean, I think, you know, there are serious questions we're not going to have time to get into of how we do church, because it's evolved through time, and it will continue to evolve. But the church of Christians bound together informally and the church gathered in some form will always be.
Okay, let's bring this to a conclusion then. I'm going to give you 3 quick questions, okay? And you've already answered them in a way, but I wanted me to give a 1 sentence each. What is the church?
The body and bride of Christ.
Why is the church important to God?
It is his family and the organ of his mission.
Gives them joy. Okay, so what do you think Christians need to keep in their heads as a foremost thought or principle about what's the point of church?
Life beyond myself.
Good. Okay. And I think that's a very good way of looking at it that we can wrap up with tonight. I think that's a very good answer for us, because living within ourselves is the biggest problem right now. Being wrapped up in ourselves, which is a pretty small bundle. But living beyond ourselves is exactly what Jesus has had us doing for 2,000 years. And it looks like that ought to be the future for the church, whatever form it takes. Living beyond ourselves. I like that. Thank you for guidance. Thank you for that. All right. Thank you, folks, for listening in. We took a couple minutes longer tonight, but on the other hand, we've taken less time than we have other times. So we're stealing back a bit of free time for you. Thank you for your time here. I want you to be thinking and again, always thinking and firing off questions. We'll be back in the new year. We get Mike back on his feet, and there's lots of more issues. We'll probably drag Alan back for a few more debates or challenging questions. if he doesn't haul off and hit me with his coffee mug. But I think it's important that we keep this process of thinking, critically thinking past the illusions and the short-sighted thinking we have, bringing the best sources to bear on the questions, and then making informed decision. Because in a day when men and women will be counted, our decisions will be what we stand for. Thank you for being here tonight. Have a great Christmas. You know, who would have thought 2,000 years ago that a refugee baby heading for Egypt with two very young and very frightened parents, chased by a king who was prepared to kill whole towns to eliminate a risk to his power, could change the world. And yet, that's why we're here, and the world could not be what it is without him. Good night.
Good night.